What if the biggest factor in building wealth isn't what you know, but what you decide? You're listening to the Do.Different.Better Show on AM 950, where we talk about money, power, and ownership without the hype. I'm your host, Elaine Rasmussen, and today we're unpacking the quiet skills that shape financial outcomes over time. Skills you won't find in any investing books, but that matter just as much as any strategy. Stay with us. What's happening, my money mavens? Welcome back to another episode of the Do Different Better Show, where we talk about wealth, wisdom, and money moves, making finance elegantly simple for everyday people. I'm your host, Elaine Rasmussen, CEO and founder of Social Impact Now, Connective Institute, and managing director of the Integrated Capital Fund. If you're listening to the show on the radio, welcome to our AM 950 community. If you're watching on YouTube, I am so glad that you're here. And if you're new to the show, this is a space where people who earn well think deeply and want their money decisions to actually make sense in real life. So today's episode, I've called this the soft skills that actually build wealth. And before you tune out thinking that this is about mindset or motivation, I really want you to hang with me because it's not that. This is really about decision making acumen and how wealthy compounds over time. Let me start with something that might sound counterintuitive for a finance show. Most people who struggle with money aren't struggling because they don't know enough. In fact, many of you listening to this are actually very well informed, maybe even too much so. You've read all the books, you've listened to all the podcasts, you've saved every article, you've got it bookmarked on your browser, and yet there's still this quiet feeling that something isn't quite clicking. There's no panic, there's no crisis, just this low level sense of uncertainty, but also urgency. If that sounds familiar, I want you to know you're not imagining anything. I want you to realize something, and I realized this a long time ago. We've been sold a very specific story about how wealth is built. The story goes a little like this. If you just earn the right tactics, the right strategy, if you have the right account, the right investment, the right structure, everything will just fall into place. So we begin to chase these tactics. We think that we're optimizing. We might make some tweaks. We might even compare notes with other folks. But here's rarely what gets said out loud. Two people can have access to the same information and end up in completely different financial places. And it's not because one of them is actually smarter than the other. Here's the challenge with tactics. Tactics are clean. Tactics are measurable. They're actually easy to explain. It's 1, 2, 3, like a recipe card. But no one talks about the soft skills: discernment, judgment, emotional regulation, boundary setting, and negotiation. Those things actually don't come with spreadsheets or step-by-step guides. So we don't talk about it and pretend that it doesn't really matter because we ignore it or we just don't talk about it at all. But if you look closely at how wealth is actually built and sustained over time, you'll notice something super uncomfortable. The biggest financial outcomes aren't determined by what people know. They're determined by how people decide. And decision making is not a technical skill. It's actually a human one. And it is so directly correlated to who you are as a human. All the things that you've experienced, all the things that you know and don't know, all the things that you believe. So let me ask you something. And I don't want you to answer out loud. Have you ever known what the right financial move was and still delayed on taking action. Or you rushed into something you technically understood, but emotionally you weren't ready for. Or you said yes to an opportunity because it sounded smart, even though it didn't actually fit your life. That gap, that space between knowledge and action, is where most financial friction actually lives, even in partnerships. Not necessarily in the ignorance, but in overwhelm, hesitation, and real or perceived pressure. So here's the reframe that I want to offer you. We don't overvalue tactics because they're actually more important. We actually overvalue tactics because they're easier to talk about. Once again, going back to my recipe analogy, they don't require us to look at, how do I actually handle uncertainty? How do I actually respond to pressure? How do I actually manage my fear of getting it wrong or my perfectionism? How do I relate to authority, money, and power? The soft skills that we don't have slow us down, and slowing down is uncomfortable in a culture obsessed with optimization. So instead of asking, what strategy should I use next? A more useful question might be, what kind of decision maker am I becoming, or do I want to be? Because wealth compounds fastest when you can tolerate ambiguity, you can say no without feeling guilty, you can negotiate without feeling like you've betrayed yourself in some kind of way, you can pause instead of panicking. And those aren't personality traits. They are actually skills, and they're actually learnable, but not just with tactics alone. So I hope that you can begin to see that, I know that this is something that I've actually learned in my personal life. I really had to start to dig into my money story. And we've talked about that. I've talked about my own money story in the first episode, but really unpacking, how do I feel with ambiguity? I recently had a conversation with a potential partner. We were going to make an investment, and we were working on this investment for over 6 months. And the person ended up, on the day before we were supposed to sign the paperwork to purchase this business, dropped out. Now, mind you, all the way through, we had done all the due diligence, we had done all the projections, we felt good about what we were going to bring to the table and how we were going to acquire a business that was already doing well. We were actually going to, we knew what we were going to implement to actually have the business do better. And I remember saying multiple times throughout, when my potential partner was sort of feeling some doubts, or feeling some concerns, I should say, not necessarily doubts. And I regularly told this person, I want a name that I realize that I have a higher tolerance of risk. I have a higher tolerance of ambiguity. I have a higher tolerance. I have over time realized that through my decision-making skill set, that I feel comfortable not knowing 100% of the answers, and being comfortable and understanding and knowing and appreciating and being okay with not having 100% of the answers. Because in any financial decision, almost every financial decision, you are not going to have 100% of the information. And if you're the kind of person that cannot make a decision without 100% of the information, then that is going to have a direct correlation to your financial life. Because of that, full stop. It's not an if, it's a fact. I'm not saying that you won't be successful. I'm not saying that you won't accomplish your goals, but I will say that it could be far more complicated, particularly if you have a life partner, and you will miss out on opportunities. Opportunities may pass you by because you are requiring that you have a overload of information that sometimes, quite frankly, isn't actually useful. It's just information for information's sake. And there's a lot of folks out there that also subscribe to that as well. I've had many friends of mine who, and actually people that I've worked with, who actually over-index for information, and now they're collecting information that's actually not useful, but it's like a security blanket for them, and they just want to gather more information. Those are the kinds of things that, one, could put you in a position where you miss a deadline. It could put you in an information of then eventually coming across a multitude of contradicting information. So it's something that you want to understand about yourself. What kind of information, how much information do I need to make decisions? What is it that I'm looking for to make this decision? Is there a calculation? Is there a spreadsheet? Is there a mentor? Is there an advisor that I can employ? But I find it's very important for you to understand as a human, what is my decision matrix, right? And a decision matrix is understanding how do you make decisions? Are you the kind of person, maybe you have a spiritual advisor that you need to speak to? How long does it take to get in contact with that spiritual advisor? And then how long do you need to talk to that spiritual advisor? And then do you need to speak to your partner? And what kind of things, what's the timeline of having a conversation with your partner? Does it typically take one conversation, two conversations, three conversations? Do you need to talk about it with your parents or a sibling or another significant other? All of those things are now part of your decision matrix. It's the non-technical pieces that you need to feel comfortable with making a decision. Now, the goal of getting a decision matrix isn't necessarily to make decisions faster, right? It's not to necessarily change how you make decisions. That's not the goal of understanding how you make decisions. The goal is that you can do them faster. So if you know that decisions that are linked to $25,000 or more, these are the kinds of things that I need to know. I need to have 3 sources. I need a spreadsheet. I need to talk to my spiritual advisor. And now that you've mapped that out, right? Before you were just haphazardly going through and making decisions, but you were doing the same decision-making process every single time. Once you identify it, you can then start to put together a matrix that now you can go to. I often tell people, especially when they're new to this process, write it all out, print it on a piece of paper that you can photocopy. And every time you have a major decision, go through that piece of paper. Eventually, what's going to happen is it's going to become rote memory, and you'll probably start to see an exponential increase in the amount of time it takes you to make a decision. So these are just some of the things that I want you to start to think about as you start to unpack and understand how is your decision making affecting how you actually do your life, particularly your financial life. I'll give you this one last example before we transition. I'm doing an event when this show airs. I will be doing an event that day on January 18th. And I did something that actually I was more overt with it, but many retailers, anybody who's selling anything on the internet, for the most part, uses this tactic. They take for granted that people have FOMO. So you might see that there are pricing increases after a certain date. We see this with conferences. If you've ever attended a conference, there's usually an early bird rate. The whole purpose of that one is so that people register early, so the organization has a really good idea of how many people are attending the event. But also, the whole idea is to get more people to register sooner at the better price, right? They actually are trying to get they want people to register at the better price, not at the higher price. But we as humans, we delay. Our decision making metric or matrix is, oh, well, I want to wait to see who's going to be there. I want to wait to see, where the location's going to be. I'm going to wait to see. And then you end up paying a higher price. Well, that's what happened with this event. And so it's really interesting to see, because while we are so afraid of maybe making financial decisions or making investment decisions, whatever the case may be, is that delay often comes at a cost, right? Now, that's not to say that financial decisions come with no cost, but the whole idea is that we are mitigating or lessening the amount of cost that we pay when we are actually making a financial decision sooner rather than later, but not at the expense of your financial well-being. I don't want that message to get across. But the whole idea of this is that I want you to just kind of take this in and notice. Do I wait till the third price increase before I actually purchase something? Do I wait till the last day before the sale, therefore jeopardizing because I don't know what might come up in my day and I might miss that opportunity? What are these things that you find yourself doing that actually may have cost you more money. It's really great to think about when did I miss an opportunity and what was the financial impact of that opportunity? Did I have to pay a higher price? Did I pay a higher interest rate? Maybe it was the purchase of your home or purchase of a car. Maybe it was I could have gotten a 20% discount, but I ended up only getting a 10% discount because I fooled around and I didn't actually act and press the buy button. Whatever the case may be, I just want you to start to think about and when was a time or multiple times where I've missed out, and what happened there? Was it because I was too busy? Was it because I was making excuses? Was it like, think about what that is, because those are all things you really want to understand as you start to begin your wealth journey or move your wealth journey to the next level. So, with that being said, in the next segment, we're going to talk about the first of these skills, which is discernment. And I talked a little bit about that now, but I'm going to go into a little bit more detail in the next segment. I'm also going to talk about why high earners often really struggle with discernment, even though they're responsible for making big decisions in their day-to-day work life. When it comes to their personal life or personal financial life, it becomes a little bit more of a challenge. I'm also going to talk about why having options can actually make decision making harder, and how discernment quietly separates earners from owners over time. But before we move on, quick reminder, you're listening to the Do Different Better Show. You may be listening to this on AM 950. If you ever want to revisit this episode or share it with someone who needs it, you can find the full show on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. And if this conversation resonates, come find me on Instagram. I'm sharing a new mini series called Chronicles of a Neurodivergent Black Woman in Finance. All right, y'all, let's keep this going. I will see you after the break. Welcome back to the Do Different Better Show. I'm your host, Elaine Rasmussen. Before we go any further, I want to reset the frame. When we talk about discernment, we are not talking about intuition in the romantic sense. We're not talking about gut feelings that are divorced from actual reality. And we're definitely not talking about perfection. Discernment is not always choosing correctly. Discernment is about choosing consciously. It's the ability to recognize what matters now, what can wait, and what is noise masquerading as opportunity. And for people who earn well, discernment is one of the most underdeveloped and most expensive skill there is. And I'll explain why. Here's something that often doesn't get talked about enough. The very things that help you earn more money can actively undermine your ability to choose well. High earners tend to be very, very competent. They tend to be very adaptable. They tend to be quick learners. And they're often comfortable with being stretched. Those traits are rewarded very early in careers. They're often the people who get the promotion because they've demonstrated that they're able to problem solve. They are Susie on the spot. They can come up with 10 solutions and one of them is going to hit almost every single time. But over time, they create a pattern. You become someone who can figure things out. And when you can figure things out, people assume you should. So opportunities begin to multiply, invitations begin to increase, ideas get forwarded, deals get mentioned casually, and slowly, without realizing, the question shifts. You stop asking, is this actually aligned with my life? And you start asking, am I missing out if I don't do this? And that's not discernment. That is actually pressure, whether it be internal or whether it be external. Maybe it be real or perceived. Access feels empowering. Agency is empowering, but they are not the same thing. Access means you could do something, while agency means you choose to do something. And high earners often confuse the two. They begin to collect access to investment opportunities, access to strategies, access to rooms and spaces, access to advice, but they tend to defer their agency. They might say things like, well, I don't have time, or I can hire this out, and that's fine, right? They often wait until they know more, or the timing feels perfect, or the downside is fully eliminated. However, that moment never comes. So decisions get delayed, and delayed decisions quietly cost them more than making actually bad decisions. Because even with bad decisions, you learn something valuable. It's called tuition, right? We all know what that means. One of the hardest lessons for people who are capable is this: opportunity is not automatically your opportunity. Let's sit in that for a moment. And I often say this when I'm consulting and working with entrepreneurs. I said, not every opportunity is an opportunity. Some opportunities are tests. I'm going to say that again. Not every opportunity is an opportunity. Some opportunities are tests. There's nothing morally superior about saying yes. There is nothing irresponsible about saying no. No is a whole answer with a period on the end. Discernment lives in the space in between those. This makes sense on paper, and this fits my actual capacity. And capacity is not just your money, the amount of money you have. Your capacity also should be measured or thought about in terms of time, attention, emotional bandwidth, the season of life that you're in. Ignoring capacity is how people with very strong incomes end up with very fragile systems and begin to feel, that you may have heard the term the golden handcuffs. They're like, I can't leave this job because then what am I going to do? I haven't done the things that I need to or could do to be able to have the option of whether or not I want to leave this job and move on to something else or not, right? I want to describe a pattern, and you can decide if this feels familiar to you. Someone earns well, they save responsibly, they invest in multiple places. On paper, they're doing everything right. But underneath, there's a tension. They're tracking too many things. They're mentally juggling decisions they haven't fully committed to. They're constantly asking, should I be doing more? Nothing is wrong, but nothing feels settled. That's not a discipline problem. That's a discernment problem. Too many open loops, too many intentional closure, too little intentional closure. We talk about optionality as a goal, and we don't necessarily use that term, but we say things like, oh, I would love to be a digital nomad. I'd like to be able to work from anywhere. I'd like to be able to live in such and such country for 6 months out of the year and work the other 6 months, or whatever the case may be. We talk about optionality in some of those terms. And yes, having options actually matter, but unmanaged optionality soon becomes a trap. When everything is possible, nothing feels urgent, and your priorities can begin to blur. Your commitment feels risky, so you just kind of hover. You might research instead of decide. You refine instead of choosing. You keep a lot of doors open instead of actually walking through one. And here is the quiet truth: indecision is still a decision. It just happens without your consent. So, how do I get the best possible outcome? That's the question that optimization asks. And discernment asks, which outcome is actually worth pursuing based on where I am in my career, where I am in my life, where I am in my family, where I am mentally, spiritually, physically. And optimization without discernment leads to complexity, over engineering, constant second guessing. Discernment simplifies, not because life gets easier, but because you get clearer. And clarity is everything. Discernment doesn't come from asking 20 questions. And some people judge their intellect by the amount of questions that they're able to ask, hoping that they'll get somebody off of their guard or off of their game. It actually often comes from asking one honest and direct question. What would I choose if I trusted myself more than the noise? What would I do if I trusted myself more than the noise? The noise on social media, the noise of my family, the noise of my friends, the noise of what I saw on Bloomberg yesterday, or what I saw in the Financial Times, or what I saw on the web, or what I read in ChatGPT. The question won't rush you, but it will narrow the field. And narrowing the field is how clarity actually begins. So here's where we are. Discernment helps you decide what matters, but wealth is never built in isolation. And we're going to talk more about this. In the next segment, I'm going to talk about the soft skills that show up between people: negotiation, boundaries, and emotional regulation, and why they quietly determine financial outcomes more than tactics ever will. This is why it's super, super important. You really got to have a really good understanding of like what your triggers are, whether they're, and sometimes your triggers aren't necessarily financial triggers. It could be like feeling stupid, feeling like you're left behind, feeling like, you've got to go and find more information and or get certified in a thing, right? Oh, I'm going to go become a financial advisor, or I'm going to go take the financial planner so like no one will be able to get over on me. Well, is that really what you need to be doing? Maybe not. And are you really being honest with yourself that is that actually what you need, or is that something that's going to make you feel better, right? As opposed to actually deciding, what is the information I need to decide to actually move forward in my wealth journey, whatever that looks like. And a wealth journey doesn't necessarily have to mean I want to make 5, 10, 20, 30 million dollars. It could be I want to be able to live in a tiny home in Arizona and know that everything that I need is going to be taken care of, right? If that's your wealth journey, that is okay. Let me be clear. The purpose of this is not necessarily that you are on this path to making billions of dollars. Maybe it is, and that is also okay if that is your goal. But this is about what are the systems and things that I need to put in place, and what are the things that I need to identify by myself that actually might prevent me from actually achieving that, whatever that looks like for you. So I really want you to take this moment and take all of this in. Is anything that I've mentioned to you, are you finding yourself like, yeah, I do that. Yeah, I do that. Yeah, I do that. And now that you know, what do you actually want to do about it? So we're going to be talking more about this in the final segment of this particular episode. You are listening to the Do Different Better Show. I'm your host, Elaine Rasmussen. Don't forget to catch me on Instagram at Do Better with Elaine. And don't forget to check us out on AM 950 on Sundays. Hey, y'all. Welcome back to the Do.Different.Better Show. I'm your host, Elaine Rasmussen. We are now moving into the final segment of this particular episode. And up until this point, we have been talking about discernment, which is the skill of knowing what matters, what fits, and what can wait for you, right? So, once again, discernment is really hyper personalized. It has to do with you. Where are you at in your life? What actually makes sense, right? Do you have, are you a single parent with a 2-year-old at home, or are you a two-person parent family and you have a 15-year-old at home that is getting ready to go to college? Or are you a single, person in their 40s who wants to go back to school? Where are you in your life and what actually makes sense, right? So, give you an example. Having an investment with a 20-year time horizon when you're 70 does not necessarily make the best sense unless you know that, oh, what I'm going to do is this is going to be a part of an inheritance to my children, grandchildren, or other family members. So this is what we mean by discernment. Does it make sense as a 7-year-old to make an investment that has a 20-year horizon before there's a return? That's what we're talking about. That's just a concrete example of what we're talking about when we're saying what actually makes sense, what fits, and what can wait as it relates to making decisions for yourself, particularly financial decisions. But however, discernment alone isn't enough, because wealth is not built in isolation. It's built on conversations. It's built on contracts that have timelines. It's built on relationships. And it is built on in moments of pressure, which all of this means is that how you show up between people matters just as much as what you know. And this is where a lot of smart, capable people quietly begin to lose leverage, not because of a lack of intelligence, but because they were never taught how to navigate power, others as well as their own power. So now let's start with negotiation. Negotiation, I feel, has a big, huge branding problem. I love negotiation. And actually, we negotiate all the time. We're constantly negotiating when we're driving on the road. We're constantly negotiating with our partners. We're constantly negotiating with our coworkers. We're constantly negotiating in the gym. All right. We are constantly negotiating, but we don't look at it in that particular way. We only think about negotiation when we're uncomfortable or it's something we don't want to do, or we might have to go back to somebody and renegotiate the price because of a situation. I remember that happened to me a long time ago. One of my first professional jobs, I was in charge of doing pricing, working for this manufacturing company, and I put together this whole pricing matrix on D-Base, no less, for those of you old enough to remember D-Base, and which was a very long process, but I digress. And I presented to my manager. I asked him to review all the pricing. I don't think that he did, because what ended up happening was I made a huge mistake in the pricing, which he did not bring to my attention, even though I asked him to look at it. And it ended up costing us a large amount of money that we had to end up eating, that our customer didn't have to pay for, right? I had miscalculated freight in shipping our product to South Africa, and that ended up getting me terminated from my job. So, but the moral of the story is that, I could have been afraid of negotiating, but I was like, hey, this is something that we need to do. And we just didn't do it. So for many people, negotiation always sounds aggressive, and it sounds very transactional, and it's very uncomfortable. Even if we're socialized, especially if you've been socialized to be grateful, to be flexible, not to ask for a lot, not to make things awkward, right? Living here in Minnesota, that's very much grounded in the culture, the societal organization of people. It's like, don't make waves, don't put anybody out. But is that actually the best thing for you, right? And when we think about elevating that to financial decisions, that can leave an imperative that actually can hurt you in the long run and have a very dramatic impact on your wealth journey. So instead of negotiating, people often do something else. They accommodate even when they don't want to, and it's not in their best interest. They absorb and do nothing, or they just adjust internally. They twist themselves in a pretzel to meet the situation. And this is often called as, oh, this person is so easy to work with, which in my language, the way that I hear that is that you're easy to manipulate. And I don't think that anybody, I don't care who they are, feels good if they feel like they've been manipulated, right? No one likes to be manipulated. No one likes to feel like they've been manipulated. And sometimes this they're easy to work with is actually a euphemism where I can get what I want out of this person, right? Not always, but sometimes. Here's what doesn't get discussed enough. When you don't negotiate, timelines get tighter. Expectations begin to expand because there's no boundary setting. Compensation might stagnate, right? And then resentment can grow. If you've ever thought about this in your job, you've been afraid to negotiate for a higher salary, and then you sit and then you hear maybe a year later, oh, Susie got a salary increase. And now you're resentful because you didn't do the thing that you actually wanted to do that Susie actually did, right? And that cost begins to compound. Let's say it was a $5,000 increase one year and $5,000 the next year. What could you have done with that $10,000? Would you have invested it? Would you have repaired your home? Would you have put it into a CD? Which means you have lost on all the interest that you would have gained by making that investment, no matter what you invested it in. And that cost compounds, not just financially, but emotionally. That resentment that you have that builds up, it then might influence you not making other financial decisions that are in your best interest. Because every time you override your own needs to avoid discomfort, you reinforce a pattern. The pattern is my comfort matters less than keeping my peace. I'm going to say that one more time. My comfort matters less than keeping my peace. That belief shows up everywhere, not just in your financial life, your relationship life, your spiritual life, all of it. So, I'm not going to leave you hanging. I'm going to give you a reframe. Negotiation is not about winning. It's about clarity. It's saying, here's what I need to do my best work. Or here's what I can actually commit to, and this is what I'd like you to commit to, and getting clarity about that on both sides. Or here's what doesn't work for me. I can't make that work. I don't want to make that work. That's not something I can do. It's clarity. It's not aggression. It's information. And information is the foundation of any sustainable agreement. When we think about our life partners, this could be our wedding vows. When we think about a job, it's the job offer. Is that two minds or multiple minds have come together and outlined, this is what I'm going to do. This is what you're going to do. This is what I'm not going to do. This is what you're not going to do. And even in a job offer, many people don't do this, but you can negotiate, right? Maybe instead of 14 days off in a year, you can say, hey, I would like 16. Or you know what? I don't need the health insurance. And because I don't need the health insurance, I would like that added to my compensation. I'm on my partner's health insurance. So I would like, instead of you giving me health insurance, I want the value of that to be added to my salary. These are all things that you can ask for. Doesn't always necessarily mean you're going to get them, but you can always ask, right? Now let's talk about boundaries. Boundaries are often framed as emotional or personal, but boundaries are also financial. Every boundary that you don't set creates unpaid labor, misaligned expectations, and invisible costs. And these costs show up in your money story, whether you name them or not. People who often struggle with boundaries are people who are tend to be high performers. They are reliable, consistently reliable. They are empathetic. They are first generation wealth builders, oftentimes women, many times people of color, particularly first Americans, and typically eldest daughters, because they're so used to being relied on and taking care of everything, being a surrogate mother to their siblings. They take care of everything, and they take that into their adulthood and their work life, and then as a result become over accommodating and put themselves last, not only physically but also financially. So, in other words, people who learned early that being low maintenance was rewarded. So instead of saying no, these folks just stretched themselves beyond their limitations and maybe had turned into health issues, right? Particularly as you get older. These are folks that often just absorb everything, everybody else's problems, everybody's emotional baggage, right? And then they begin to overfunction. And then because of that, people weaponize incompetence, which then stretches them even more, which means they're absorbing even more. And now it's a relentless cycle, and that they never seem to be able to get out of. And all they continue to do is start to feel resentment. And then they wonder why success feels heavier than it actually should feel. But here's the actual hard truth. You cannot build long-term wealth if your default setting is overgiving. Not because generosity is bad. Let me be clear. That is not what I'm saying. But because depletion is expensive. Just think about if you have been run yourself ragged and then you were out 2 weeks because you were sick, because you ran your body down, right? Because you didn't pause or take a break sooner. Now the amount of downtime it would have been if you just took a day off is now 2 weeks, right? Depletion is directly linked to burnout. It is directly linked to rush decision making. It is directly linked to avoiding. And it's also directly linked to poor timing. Boundaries protect your capacity, and capacity is a prerequisite for ownership. Now let's talk about the skill that ties all of this together, and that is emotional regulation. So if we thought about two sides of a coin, now we're going to talk about the hand that holds the coin, right? This is not about being calm all the time. Anybody who knows me knows, like, I have little crash outs every once in a while. And so it's not the goal to be calm all the time, right? But it's about being able to stay present when things feel uncertain. Unfortunately, money decisions trigger fear, they trigger shame, they trigger urgency, but they also trigger comparison, particularly in this world of social media. And especially for people who have worked really hard to get to where they are. And when those emotions spike, decision quality drops. Dysregulation doesn't look dramatic. It looks like rushing into decisions to relieve anxiety. It looks like avoiding decisions because they feel heavy. They cause you to say yes because now is the moment, right? And saying no because I don't trust myself yet. None of these are logic problems. They're nervous system problems. When you're regulated, you can pause instead of panic. You can ask questions instead of assuming. You can wait without spiraling out of control. And you can say no without over-explaining. It's not the right time for me. I don't see how that's going to benefit me at this moment. I don't have the capacity, whatever, or just saying no, right? Like, again, no is a whole sentence. That's actually leverage, not because you're dominant, but because you're steady. Steadiness is incredibly persuasive. So now let's bring all of this together. Discernment helps you choose what matters. Negotiation helps you articulate it. Boundaries protect it. Emotional regulation sustains it. And none of these require you to become harder, colder, or more aggressive. They require alignment between what you value, how you decide, and how you show up. And here's what I want to leave you with. Wealth is not built by becoming someone else. It's built by becoming more yourself with clarity, steadiness, and intention. If today's episode gave you a language for something you've been feeling but couldn't quite name, I want you to just let that sit. And if you feel called to it, let me know. Send me a comment, send me an email, hit me up on Instagram. But I just want you to know you don't have to rush into any action. You don't need to optimize this insight. Just notice where it landed and what landed. If you want to continue the conversation with me, subscribe to the Do.Different.Better Show on YouTube. You can follow me on Instagram for Chronicles of a Neurodivergent Woman, Black Woman in Finance, and explore upcoming events and resources at www.dodifferentbetter.com. And to our AM 950 listeners, thank you for being part of this community and for supporting thoughtful conversations about money and power. I'm Elaine, and until next time, do different and do better.